I'm here with Ceri Davies, who is a director at Repair Cafe Wales. He has contributed in many ways, but one of those ways more recently has been to write the strategy document for Repair Cafe Wales. So I guess, first of all, thank you for joining us, Ceri. Very kind of you.
Thanks, Joe. No problem.
And I wondered if, before we focus on Repair Cafe Wales, if you could give us a bit of background about what your background's in and what you're up to in your day job.
Yeah. So background, got a history degree from Cardiff University, and I've spent much of my working life in the public sector, working for Welsh Government in a variety of portfolio areas, delivering a number of projects. Strategy and planning has been key to that. I left that element of the public sector several years ago to work with a social enterprise called IndieCube. Worked a lot on the strategy and the planning of that organisation. Since done work in public affairs, my own consultancy work, and including trying to develop a few personal business projects. I'm currently back in the public sector, strangely in strategy and planning for Companies House.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. Good. Okay, so just a quick aside. You're quite interesting. Well, you're interesting for many reasons. One of those reasons is that you've experienced strategy in the public sector versus the more entrepreneurial sort of IndieCube startup type. I guess they're very different beasts.
Yeah, very, very different. I'd say if you're trying to look at it and study it, they should be considered very, very separate, really, in terms of how they operate, how they plan. It's hard to put into words without thinking too hard about this, but the public sector is very much, if it's a political side, so you're delivering a manifesto, you can very much work towards that. That's your objective, that's your aims, your resource to do that. Resources can move about very, very quickly with no kind of obvious repercussions. And then when you're working for a small independent business, bottom line was what drove us at the time. Although we had very much community objectives and aims and working for our members, we still had to keep the organization going, and that drove a lot of the harder decisions. So how you plan for that and prepare for those kind of things, very, very different approaches. I'm not saying techniques and things like that, but I found them worlds apart, actually. And then some of the public affairs side of things was in the charitable sector, where I've also spent time on boards, and those kind of approaches to strategy and planning are very different again. Again, it's about resources and funding, and that's probably the big difference between the sectors, in that one, it's not limitless, but you've got a security of employment for the foreseeable future, which gives you a very different mindset and approach to what you can deliver and how you deliver it. Whereas when you're both in the charity sector and the social enterprise, when you're just looking a lot further shorter term on how you're going to keep things going, how the next bills get paid, it brings a crystallization into what you do, which probably isn't there in the public sector, certainly in my experience.
Okay, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was chatting to Jemin earlier today, and we were saying how contingent Repair Cafe Wales strategy is on funding, and if someone happens to throw $250,000 at us, our strategy is our strategy and plan certainly is very different to what it might be otherwise. So going back a bit before jumping forward again, what brought you to Repair Cafe Wales?
So you might remember. So one of my passions is the stuff I'm involved in is very much environmental, both from a professional point of view, where I worked in a number of quite high-profile areas for government, delivering things like the Climate Change Commission for Wales, the single-use carrier bag charge. And that kind of professional side of it has really snowballed in the last decade, and I've been involved in other environmental organizations and causes. And I'm not saying I'd be called a sandal-wearing environmentalist, a traditionalist, but I recognize that some of the biggest problems we face, both locally, nationally, and globally, are the environment. So I try to help out in an awful lot of areas, in an awful lot of ways. And Repair Cafe Wales was something very much on my, not the agenda, but very much on my radar from when you and Ceri started it. You started it in a local cafe stroke chapel, very close to where I live. At the time, I was with IndieCube, and I remember that I met you and Ceri, and I very much wanted to assist from the IndieCube point of view, the spaces, the community organizations we were with, to try and join things up and make and get that growth quite quickly for you. We weren't that successful then, but I've since used Repair Cafe Wales on a number of occasions just as a regular user. So when the recent, or not so recent, probably about a year ago, inclination for further directors to come on and join and push for the next level of growth, I was really keen to be involved, to bring some of the skills I've got from, like I say, the public sector, the funding, which I think the organisation needs, the IndieCube social community experiences I've got, even the public affairs work I've done. Wanted to bring that on board, and if useful, see if I could help. And as you've alluded to earlier, one of the things I've taken on board and decided to run with is to get the strategy into a place where it was always there, but where it's in a frame position to be utilised to add a little bit more value when we're dealing with stakeholders.
It's very kind of you to say it was always there, but I think a few people might have disagreed. It was in the back of my head somewhere. I think it would be generous to say. Okay, so in terms of, before moving on to the strategy side of things, in terms of Repair Cafe as an organisation, what would you say in terms of strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities?
So it's so what I'm going to talk about is very much a mixture of my pre-board knowledge and experience combined with what I've garnered as a board member. So strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the strength, I think,
or whatever you want to talk about, but loosely.
The strengths are very much the brand is there. I think it's well recognised now in large parts of Wales as an organisation which leads that repair movement, and that the approach to circular economy, repairing things, community cohesion, addressing some of the well-being issues we've got. I think it's well recognised in that regard. I think it's recognised by key stakeholders, but it's one of the leading players in that area. So key funders, the charitable sector, government recognise that it is one of the leading voices in that area. And I think, it's taken several years to build up. Other strengths are, it actually does what it says on the tin. It's through volunteers. It's got cafes pre-COVID across Wales, actually doing what we want to do, which is to repurpose, reuse, fix consumables from the community, and also teaching skills, showing people what can be done. I in my head, I've called it a return to the past, which got taken out of the strategy, but it's very much, I was at the tail end in growing up in the late 70s, 80s of that kind of community approach where my family, the wider family, grandparent, everything was repaired, refixed, passed on. And I think it's only really the late 70s, 80s, 90s consumerism and materialism has moved us away from that approach.
Mm.
I find it a little bit, it resonates with my work on carrier bags, where everyone thinks carrier bags have been free and available for decades and decades, but they only really became free in the early 90s. Before that, you paid for them or people used other things. So it is a little bit of returning to how we operated in the past, where materials were valued more.
Mm.
So that's those are strengths. I think, what it does do it. It says what it's going to do and does it well. Weaknesses, I think, since I've been on board, I thought it was a fully funded and
Yes.
had staffed organisation to do what it did.
Yes. Yeah.
I really did. Thought there was at least one or two people making this happen. So to see that it's volunteers, and the work and the effort that's needed, and although some projects, we get funding for, but they're for the lifetime of that project, they don't allow the organisation to really grow and build, because they're simply, the funding is focused on that project. So again, the growth and everything else around it is reliant on volunteers. So I compare that with some of the other charities I've been involved with, not so commercially minded, but Keep Wales Tidy is another one. I've been a board member. And what that organisation has, it's of a scale where it's got core funding, which allows people to run the organisation and then have specific project delivery. And that's where I'd like Repair Cafe to be. But at the moment, it is that volunteer management. I think that it is a weakness, I think, because I know that we can do an awful lot more. Is, as I said earlier, if we had people full-time paid without fear of the end of the contract, they know what we're going. It allows a lot longer planning for what we want to do in terms of the operational planning rather than the strategy, to know that people are going to be there post the end of the financial year. Weaknesses, I think that the weakness stems from that, the volunteer side of it. Because we don't have that, there's some aspects of governance framework in which I'd probably expect to be in place, and trying to work towards that. I'm not trying to be too onerous on governance, but trying to put in place a structure which allows the organisation to move forward a little bit easier.
Ceri, can I interrupt you for a second, because I'm aware that some of the people watching this video won't know what governance is. So could you just give us an example of what governance might look like for an organisation like this?
Well, I can only, so what my experience is on what I'd like to see is the board would have quite a high level strategic input into the organization. So they'd be the ones who would be undertaking the governance to make sure that what we've committed to deliver for funding from funders, government, trusts, whatever, we are achieving what we've promised to deliver. Our wider financial income is putting us in a position for stability and to get us to where we want to be. And we're providing that strategic direction level. So, and then with that board position at that level, I'd expect that to be accompanied by a certain degree of corporate responsibility in terms of how we manage our finances, the daily operation of the organization, and how we report and manage that. And then alongside that, you've got the direction you want to give the organization. So choosing what our long-term strategy is, which we can come on to, but then how we get there, what opportunities we as a small organization choose to follow up of all the ones we might be able to find. Where do we want to put our time and resource to make our strategy happen for us? And then below that, you've got operational governance, which I wouldn't expect the board to be so heavily involved with. But what I found with Repair Cafe Wales is that is probably where we're missing a tier. And that's what I mean about the funding. We don't have that kind of paid for management level within the organisation to run the organization wider than just specifically funded projects.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful, and you put that very clearly. So, so actually, I understand it a bit better as well now. Okay.
And
So
then,
go on.
No, I was just going to say on the opportunities, I think Repair Cafe Wales is perfectly positioned at the very opportune moment to take advantage of the general public awareness and awakening of climate issues, consumer issues, the need to repair, maintain goods, use less, the materialistic side of things. And it's also at the same time as key funders, government, trusts and foundations want to support that type of work, including the development of skills, the retention of skills, and the social cohesion we want to try and get into communities. I'm not saying it's gone from a lot, but these type of activities are really, really good in building that community and social cohesion.
It ticks a lot of it ticks a lot of boxes, doesn't it, in terms of stakeholders, I guess. Okay, so moving on to the sort of strategy that you've produced. Could you talk us through how you went about that? Because I know a lot of people watching this video would be, because it's different from the private sector in terms of in the private sector, you could say keep it simple. It's maximizing shareholder returns or stakeholder returns or whatever. With the business model you've got, I guess what we've got is complicated by the fact that firstly it's a startup, and secondly it's in the third sector, and fourthly there's a lot of different people involved with different views about what our strategy could be. So could you talk us briefly through how
I'll talk you through my approach to it, which is by no means one I'd recommend people to do if they were starting from scratch.
Yeah, okay.
So I recognized quite quickly, and I think there was a lot of information there. The website was really, really well done. It had the vision, the values, the mission, and an awful lot of what I would like to see in a strategy already done.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't starting from scratch. So it wasn't about going out, speaking to stakeholders, speaking to volunteers, which I would like to do if I was starting from scratch, to build that up. I didn't go through a rigorous kind of strategic assumptions approach. So we make the assumptions of what we want to do. I felt that it was already there in a lot of the material which was available to me, which had been put into previous documentation to go to stakeholders or funders. So I saw this, the way I took this strategy approach was kind of like an unwritten constitution. It was there. It was just a matter of put it into a framework, which, as I say, I've done that a few times before. I've been involved with other organizations and their approach to strategy, and being a board member overseeing strategy development elsewhere. So all that experience I put together, quite happy to write and draft these kind of things into what I'd like to see. Had a rough template from a previous one I've already done. I wanted quite a short strategy to distill everything which had been supplied to me and put it in quite a brief document framework, which very clearly set out our vision, why we do what we do, and what our kind of key objectives are, short and long term. But essentially so that in addition to the website information, our partners, our customers, users, whoever we engage with, there was quite a quick document available for them to very quickly see what we were about, why we were about it, and what we wanted to do. That's what I wanted from a strategy. Quite a clear, quick guide to who we are, what we are, and why we are. I think one of the strategy courses I've done, I think Fujifilm famously had a strategy, was to kill Kodak, and that was their strategy. There's more to it than that, but I don't think a strategy for us needed to go into particularly as a volunteer organisation at the moment, needed to go into reams and reams of paper. I just wanted it quite short. And for me, I recognised where I've worked before and what's worked well for me before. That strategy is then utilised to influence business planning or operational plans. And that's where I get a lot more value. And I think that's where, because you're involved, without saying the weaknesses again, I think that's where the weakness in the Repair Cafe was, in that the business plan and the business planning side of it, that kind of detail. So the strategy was really, when I started it, was meant to be a quick win, turn it around relatively quickly, and then move on to some of the other documentation, which I think would benefit the organisation. The strategy has taken longer than I expected, because I think it's one of those things where it's development by committee, which is a good thing. I want people's involvement, but I think they needed to be involved. I hope the board members don't say it. But when you're involved, I needed that input quickly, clearly, concisely, and I needed people to put it in how they wanted it, rather than coming in piecemeal and after the date. Because as a voluntary organisation, we were using volunteer designers, and a lot of what I wanted to do was to put a professional spin on it. So, I wrote the Word strategy document relatively quickly, but then the presentation aspect of it is key. I can't remember where I'm going with this now, but so that's how I approached the strategy. Okay. And I would have really liked, again, it's because people are volunteer, and if you're full-time management drafting this to present to a board rather than the volunteer board drafting it, it would have been undertaken quite differently. And so I think having people available a lot more, and so the documentation I work for in Companies House, for example, you get everyone in a room and you can go through it line by line and tweak it and make amendments in that regard, a read through. But we couldn't do that so easily with this strategy. I found that was quite difficult. And then, some changes I perhaps wasn't agreed. I didn't agree so much with, but we got to a point where I really wanted this document to be over the line, because I think it clearly says what I wanted it to say, and I didn't want to go to town on it, whereas I think some others did, because I really want to move on to the next level of governance documentation.
Okay, thank you. And I remember in a conversation with you some time ago, when I think it was at the stage where everyone was trying to make, putting in their oar and trying to make this a much bigger beast than it needed to be. And that you said, I might be misquoting you here, but I thought it was quite insightful that you said, you need to have the formal, strategy sort of out there, presented, looking good, and all the rest of it. But behind that lives a living strategy, which is a bit more complicated, is more contradictory, perhaps, than the one that's presented in the public face, and something that evolves over time, depending on. Now, then they overlap, obviously, because you can't have an internal strategy going that way and your external, picture saying you're going that way. So there is overlap, but I guess also in the background there's this constant, with every board meeting almost we have a strategy discussion, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think the same as anything, a strategy is only really reliant on the day it's published. After that, it can be changed. It's evolving, it's changing, and you can't, particularly in I don't think any organisation will, but we've put the strategy, we signed the strategy off last night to review in a year's time. And what we'll do is this is where I think our business planning side will come in, and how things change, develop, any kind of new directions we begin to explore, we can address when we review the strategy next year or 18 months time.
Yeah.
But the formal strategy, which is out there now, is just that kind of very high level guidance, and the actual work we do to deliver that strategy, that is behind the scenes and can change quite considerably. I wouldn't expect, I think it's one of yours, but it's, our kind of key strategy in a quote is, we want a repair cafe in every town and city in Wales. I don't think we'll move too far from that anytime soon. We can expand on that, talk about skills, community cohesion, which is what the document does. But the business, the operational plan, we can take every opportunity we want, every avenue to make that kind of quote vision happen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I guess that leads me to another question, which is around the sort of the internal process. So, and because you've got so much experience in strategy development, I'd like your view on this, because I've seen strategy, but from a private sector perspective. It seems to me that when your end point isn't profit, and it's something that's, even something like opening as many repair cafes as possible, there's various opportunities that we have. So we could do apprenticeships and training programs, we could go into schools, we could have a remakery, we could upcycle and sell things, we could merge with Benthig. There's all these opportunities. And I guess, one of the big things is that we're constrained in terms of our time. And we're also constrained in terms of funding. But how does one, if you're involved in strategy, how do you go about prioritizing all those opportunities? Or is it, on a case by case? Is there no golden rule? Or is this something that it's just Repair Cafe Wales that has this problem?
Yeah, no, I think you're talking through difficulties of every individual strategy and how each organisation approaches those is different. Where to start on that, really? I think I should have taken notes, Joe. I think having that clarity of purpose is key, but depending on which sector you're in, it does change how you deliver on that kind of clarity of purpose. So if your funding is secure and you know that people are turning up 9 to 5, day in, day out for the long-term future, that allows them to do things in a different way and have less focus on the dirty word, which is money, which is the big thing between the sectors. How you go about getting that to allow that kind of day-to-day operation to deliver what you want. So I haven't worked yet in the private sector to a great extent, something I really want to go to. Even IndieQ was a social enterprise, but with very much community and membership ideals. But public sector, you know what resource you've got, what resource you can bring in. It's there, and you therefore plan accordingly. And what you're trying to achieve is different, because you're not just trying to achieve the resource to keep yourself going. You're trying to achieve that kind of end point. So, for example, when I was delivering single-use carrier bags, I knew the resource I had in my team. I could move it around the team and also bid for other resource from the public sector. And that made delivering a massive piece of policy work a lot simpler than if you were trying to fund the team to deliver that work, which is very much where Repair Cafe is. Its aim is to have those repair cafes across Wales to achieve the aims of reducing waste, building skills, community cohesion. So those are the aims. But to achieve that, you also need that kind of resource to do that. And you can do it voluntarily, but that's a lot of hard work, and it's working on goodwill and you can achieve so much more with someone doing that 9 to 5 job 5 days a week. That what you can achieve with that in various scenarios I've been in is hugely different, the best will in the world, to somebody picking it up a few evenings a week and their weekends, because that's very, very hard. It's great, but you need that full-time resource. So that's where I think, I'm sure I'm going off your original question here, but
I mean, it's all interesting. So don't
but that's where I think and it's not so much in the strategy, because I think we've got in the strategy that we need to work to be sustainable. But I think this is where the board did have some kind of issues, and something we'll have to look at again. But it is on our business operations side of it. How are we funded? Are we commercial? Do we go down that route? But to go down a commercial route with volunteers is, again, as I said, very, very hard. Whereas if we move into a more charitable route and rely a lot more on funding, which is where I actually thought we were aiming for, it takes us into a different route in terms of how you achieve that funding. So these are things the board, although we've got the strategy in place, these are areas of refinement we need to address at some point.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just making a note of that, because that's something that we're going to need to address, as you say. Good. Okay. Well, I don't think, I'm just going to check my question list, which I should have sent you in advance, but failed miserably. I don't have any other questions. Can you think of any questions that I should have asked you that I haven't?
Not in terms of, let me just think. I suppose for me, a big thing from the piece of work you might be getting people involved with is that link between strategy and the plans below that, how those are then developed, how those are operated, and what the links between the two are.
Okay.
I think that's kind of key. It's something I'm working on at the moment between the organisation I work for, Companies House, has got a new 5-year strategy, and then how that flows through the organisation, through the top level corporate business plan, through to the kind of directorate level plans, how everything needs to flow back up to the strategy. So that's something on the wider side we could have discussed, I suppose, is how the strategy flows through the rest of the organisation.
Okay, Ceri, you'll have to explain this to me, because I can see the strategy coming down through directors and operations and down to whoever's doing the work. You also mentioned about it flowing up again. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think strategy flows. I'm not sure if I meant it to flow up. It definitely flows down, but I do think you've got to take things have got to go upwards as well, so that it influences the business planning and eventually the strategy. So, we'd want, in the sector I'm in now, we want all staff to understand what they do, how that is important, and how they're delivering on the strategy. And that's what I'd like Repair Cafe to be. Although it's not team, paid for employees, volunteers have an understanding of what they're delivering as part of our strategy. Yeah. But also, in the same sense, we want volunteers or team members to feed upwards where they think we should go, how they can influence both business planning and then longer term strategy and direction.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm just making a note around. It's the connection between the strategy and the plan, but it's also about how the strategy is formulated itself, the process of creating strategy.
Yeah, and like I say, so both strategies I've talked about there, both Repair Cafe and Companies House, it's I've come in at a stage slightly after where they've been done to an extent. So it's not starting from scratch. So it's not going out and having those initial conversations with all the stakeholders, the partners, to develop it from scratch.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Okay, Ceri, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Sorry, I'm a bit scruffy, and a Movember's still there.
Oh yeah, very impressive. I will. Thank you.